So I have to say this, unfortunately, Trenbolone was never good. It was always inflammatory. Welcome to Vigorous PEDs yet again. I'm Coach Steve, and I give you guys exactly what you asked for through direct messages, and that's the Trenbolone profile video series. So we're just going to continue with the PED profiles, coming from probably my favorite anabolic-androgenic steroid, namely Parabolan, after testosterone, because testosterone is, of course, the best hormone you can get your hands on, exogenously or endogenously, if you're producing sufficient amounts. Anyway, I'm rambling, so we're going to transition into my least favorite anabolic androgenic compound, and that's Trenbolone. Now, personally, I haven't used Trenbolone for maybe 7 to 8 years after my wife, not begged, but just told me, said, hey, lay off the Tren, because my mood was impossible and intolerable. So I'm sure a lot of you guys heard that Tren was a divorce in a bottle. Now, we weren't married at that time, but she was definitely wifey material. So, it was an easy choice. The Tren went out the window the same day. But I still remember what it felt like, and I still remember all the anabolic benefits that I got from it. And I still readily prescribe it to clients, or recommend it to clients when they're doing a contest prep. So let's just go into all of it, starting with the history of Trenbolone, because it's of course important to understand where Trenbolone is coming from and if it's still FDA approved and available as a pharmaceutical for human consumption. Spoiler alert, no. No, Trenbolone is no longer FDA approved for humans. It hasn't been FDA approved since 1997. So that's, 23 years ago that it's been pulled off the market. But it is FDA approved for cattle. So that's where you find the Trenbolone acetate implants or pellets from. Trenbolone acetate pellets are injected into cattle subcutaneously with something that is reminiscent of a harpoon. For the guys that have pets and they got their pets chipped, it's quite a thick injection needle, because these pellets are, of course, almost the size of a normal tablet, and they have to be, it's quite an invasive method. It's definitely not as easy as a intramuscular injection where you get to pass the oil, because I have to inject an actual pellet. So the pellets were introduced in 1970 by Hoogst Rousel under the name Finaject and Finaject, depending on which country. I think it was Finaject in France and Finaject in the UK and the United States. So that was the first tablet or pellet of Trenbolone acetate that was commercially available for livestock, not for human consumption. Trenbolone acetate was never FDA approved for humans. I believe at one point there was a Trenbolone acetate injection available, or maybe, I'm not really sure, maybe it got never marketed, but I remember reading something about Trenbolone acetate being available as an injectable in the early 1980s. It could have already been an underground lab, because of course many underground labs used Finaject and Finaject to produce Trenbolone acetate injections, but we'll get into that a little bit later in this video. Right now, Finaject and Finaject is no longer FDA approved. I believe it got pulled off the market in 1987, so Hoogst Rousel no longer produces Finaject or Finaject. But Merck still produces Finaplix in two different kinds. Finaplix S, which is about 70 milligrams per pellet, 70 milligrams Trenbolone acetate per pellet, and Finaplix H, which is 200 milligrams Trenbolone acetate per pellet. Now, some of the cattle would get these subcutaneous injections of 10 pallets of Finaplix. And it, of course, it highly depends on how much they wanted to increase the profitability of cattle, because, look at it this way. Cattle have usually a certain amount of days allocated to them before they're ready for the slaughterhouse. So cattle without Finaplix or without Trenbolone acetate would be maybe ready for the slaughterhouse in several years. But after they introduced Finaplix, this being ready for the slaughterhouse, being ready for consumption, basically got dramatically reduced, which increased the profitability of cattle, because the quicker turnover, of course, the more profit you make. So this is the reason why they introduced Trenbolone acetate for cattle, because it produced so much more muscle growth, which is, of course, highly desired amongst bodybuilders. But it comes with a myriad of side effects, which we'll get into this video series pretty in depth. I think I'll make a separate video about Trencoff and a separate video about Trenbolone anger management and Trenbolone night sweats, all separate videos to cover the unique characteristics besides the anabolic benefit that Trenbolone obviously has. Now, Merck also produces another product called Rivalor, which contains 200 milligrams of Trenbolone acetate per pallet, including 20 milligrams of estradiol. Now, they found out a long time ago that when you combine Trenbolone with estradiol, the overall anabolism of the cattle and the profitability increased. And because of the increased profitability and accelerated muscle growth amongst cattle when you combine Trenbolone acetate with estradiol, cattle herders and farmers started combining Finaplix S and H with a product called Sinovex S, which is produced, or the manufacturer is Zootis. And the Sinovex S contained 200 milligrams of progesterone plus 20 milligrams of estradiol. So that's, let's say, the highest dose of Finaplix H, 200 milligrams of Trenbolone acetate, 200 milligrams of progesterone, and 20 milligrams of estradiol. And I can't for the life of me imagine how a cow would feel on this combination. I mean, that high progesterone, it's almost pregnancy-like in women, of course, because their progesterone levels go up so high. So now you have, you're replacing the testosterone, the bioidentical testosterone with Trenbolone. So that's the new T in TRT, Trenbolone replacement therapy, only valid for cattle. Plus 200 milligrams of progesterone for 400 milligrams of progesterogenic activity and 20 milligrams of estradiol on top. I mean, I wouldn't even want to know. It's good that cows can't complain and can't tell you how they feel, because I feel this combination is borderline animal abuse. And if a human were to do this ratio of Trenbolone, progesterone, and estradiol, it would be an instant mindfuck. 100%. These people would lose their mind. And I'm sure when you, for the guys that have been to a cattle farm, when you see the look in the eyes of a cow that's obviously on Trenbolone. I mean, I've seen people administer Finaplix in Holland. One of my friends was a farmer, and they had some livestock, not a large amount, but a decent amount as a side business. And they administered, I think it was Finaject at the time. I mean, it's a really long time ago. And all those cows at that farm, the 20, 30 cows that they have, they were, the look in their face, man, that explains a lot, considering now that I have some experience with Trenbolone and the progesterogenic activity of it. Yeah, I feel it's borderline animal abuse, but this is the food industry, and the people got to get their steaks in, right? So those are the pallets. Now these pallets, after the FDA-approved Parabolan, which we'll get into a little bit later, got discontinued in 1997. The underground labs started using Finaplix to extract and convert the Trenbolone acetate to Trenbolone acetate injections in cottonseed, grapeseed, whatever. So if you go to basekilleronline.com, you can find all these older recipes on how to extract Trenbolone acetate from Finaplix or Finaject or Finajet tablets. It's actually quite interesting. And I remember reading another home brewer doing the same thing with Rivalor S, and they had a very unique extraction method to get the estradiol out. But I remember that wasn't really favorable because people were still worried that their Trenbolone acetate had a hint or minute trace amount of estradiol in it. So I don't think that extraction method ever got any popularity over the extraction method from Finaject or Finaplix, because of course it doesn't contain estradiol. Now, I don't think that's done. Maybe in some backyard somewhere for the guys that can't order their raws from China. I mean, never say never, right? But I think Trenbolone acetate powders has largely been replaced from the Finaject and Finaplix to raw manufacturers in China or India or Russia or whatever it's coming from nowadays. So I feel that the Trenbolone acetate on the market right now, even though it's underground labs, I don't think there's any concern for estradiol contamination, besides the concern for heavy metal contamination and the synthetic carrier oil and maybe underdosing or swapping out the raws. It's not FDA approved, so you always run a risk. Use a ROI test or a lab max or send it in for HPLC testing to make sure that the Trenbolone, as mentioned on the label, the Trenbolone acetate is actually 50, 75, 100 milligrams per milliliter, and the oil is not synthetic. Again, I have to mention it every time because I'm the only one in this fitness industry and the bodybuilding community mentioning the synthetic carrier oils. Man, I hope it catches on at one point, and then maybe somebody will give me some recognition for bringing it to the limelight in the fitness industry. Anyway, let's move on to Parabolan, which was produced by Negma Laboratories in France, and it was FDA approved from 1980 to 1997. And I believe the reason why it got discontinued and pulled off the market is because there was a lot of concerns in the medical community for doping. So even though it was FDA approved in cases of anemia only in France and never anywhere else, I believe it was approved for anemia and muscle wasting disease, and similar to how Parabolan is still FDA approved in Turkey and Spain for anemia and muscle wasting diseases. Again, the information is sometimes a little bit hard to find. So if I'm off somewhere in my dating or the medical applications, I'm sorry, the internet doesn't always tell me what I need to know, because it's, sometimes it's somewhere buried in the way back when machine, and, you can't find the information, unfortunately, anymore. And I certainly wasn't using Trenbolone, or Parabolan or Trenbolone acetate back then. So Parabolan was the only FDA approved Trenbolone that was out there for a limited period of time, 17 years in total. And you can see that it was readily used by the bodybuilding industry when you go to the Mr. Olympia in 1979 and compare the pictures to 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983. The progression of the physiques, I don't want to say it, but I'll say it anyway. That's Trenbolone, baby. So the Parabolan ester was Trenbolone HexaHydroBenzylCarbonate, abbreviated to Trenbolone Hex or Trenhex, as everybody knows it nowadays, or they still call it by Parabolan. There are a couple places where you can still find Parabolan, which is produced under pharmaceutical-like conditions in a third world country where they're somehow able to get a license to produce Trenbolone HexaHydroBenzylCarbonate in a pharmaceutical formula. But I'll say this, in the first world, in the Western world, Trenbolone is no longer used or FDA approved for human consumption. So consider that third world pharma at best. It might be accurately dosed. It might be 100% sterile. It might be, have the right ratio of organic hair oils to benzobenzoate and benzoyl alcohol, but it's not FDA approved, but it's close enough, so that's probably the closest you can get nowadays to legitimate Parabolan, which is FDA approved up until 1997. Now, those Parabolan ampules were 1.5 milliliters and contained 76 milligrams of Trenbolone Hex. Without the ester, it would be exactly 50 milligrams of actual Trenbolone. Now, the half-life of Trenbolone HexaHydroBenzylCarbonate is 14 days. A little bit later on, the underground labs, the underground scene through the raw manufacturers in China, they started producing Trenbolone enanthate with a half-life of 10 to 12 days. And injectable Trenbolone acetate has a half-life of 3 to 4 days. So here's a fun fact for you guys. Negma Laboratories Parabolan was produced in Arachis oil. So I'll put up the insert and the packaging on screen. Just keep in mind that it was FDA approved in France, so the insert and the packaging is in Français. And there you see it clearly, Hull de Arachicide neutraliseur. Now I'm sure I butchered that because, the last time I took train was 7 years ago, and the last time I had French in school was several decades ago. So for my French audience, I'm sorry for mispronouncing. I'm just reading it as it is. So Parabolan was produced in Arachis oil. Now for the guys that have been following me for a while, I'm sure you already know what I'm going to say about Arachis oil, but I'll remind you again. It rhymes with masturbation. That's right. Systemic inflammation. Now, it doesn't happen for everybody because I've seen blood work on Arachis oil from Aspen Cystanon 250 or Organon Decadurabolin, which is both produced in Arachis oil. But for a lot of people, they get an adverse reaction from Arachis oil. So I'll have to say this, unfortunately, Trenbolone was never good. It was always inflammatory. And of course, in the last few years, it's come to the limelight that Trenbolone, regardless of ester, tremendously increases inflammatory prostaglandins. That's one of the causes of trend cough, which we'll get into in the trend cough video. You know what? I'll give you guys a spoiler. If you suffer from trend cough, a little bit of Ventolin is going to send you a long way. But again, we'll save the administration practices for the trend cough video so you don't completely skew over it. So the Parabolan was formulated in inflammatory Arachis oil, which happens for a lot of people. And then the Trenbolone itself increases inflammatory cytokines and prostaglandins just from the compound alone because it's such a potent androgen. So you can actually relabel and rename Parabolan from Negma Laboratories, and the good reason that it's been discontinued for such a long time. Just call it what it is. Injectable inflammation in a vial. So don't be the guy that says, oh, Parabolan is the best. It was legitimately inflammation in a bottle. And I'm glad it's been pulled off the market because inflammation contributes highly to cardiovascular disease. And a potent androgen like Trenbolone will completely skew your lipid levels, and there's no red yeast rice or citrus bergamot or any other form of lipid management besides actual statins to get your lipids in a favorable range. So if you see your LDL pushing up to the 200s and your C-reactive protein on the high sensitivity test is like 3 milligrams to 5 milligrams, simply because the Trenbolone raises it regardless of the carrier oil that it's in. But if it was on Parabolan, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, they didn't know about this. 5 years ago, they didn't know about this until I brought it to the fitness industry. So I'm sure a lot of guys back then experienced a tremendous amount of inflammation. Now, the good thing is that back in the 80s and 90s, people were not as abusive as they are now. Back then, 1 ampule Parabolan, 2 ampule Parabolans, and 3 ampules Parabolans per week was pushing it. So that's between 50 milligrams to 150 milligrams of actual Trenbolone per week. Nowadays, hormone replacement clinics prescribe Trenbolone, enanthate or acetate at 150 milligrams per week. I've heard a lot of horror stories. There's one hormone replacement clinic here in Thailand that prescribes Trenbolone acetate or Trenbolone enanthate. And I have no idea how that's possible because Trenbolone is not FDA approved. Somehow they're still able to get away with it. What can I say? Anyway, so Trenbolone by itself causes some systemic inflammation, and the old Parabolan would cause tremendous systemic inflammation. But luckily back then, people did a very conservative amount of 2 ampules or 3 ampules per week. So their C-reactive protein levels shouldn't have been this high. And I don't think they induce cardiovascular disease, again, because it's 3 milliliters of Arachis oil per week. But I've seen blood work on 3 milliliters, 4 milliliters of Arachis oil per week. And those C-reactive protein readings would have been 10 milligrams per liter, maybe even 15 milligrams per liter. But that's on the cystanon. I've seen blood work on Trenbolone acetate in cottonseed oil and grapeseed oil and sesame oil and MCT oil. And again, adding in the Trenbolone on top of a testosterone base increases inflammatory markers, the C-reactive protein levels, to maybe top of the supposedly healthy reference range of up to 5 milligrams per liter. While in reality, you should keep your C-reactive protein between or below 1 milligram per liter. Ideally 0.1, 0.5 milligrams per liter. I mean, you'll always get a little bit of inflammation when you start injecting foreign compounds into your body. So the base testosterone was a C-reactive protein of 0.5 milligrams per milliliter, and adding a little bit of Trenbolone on top already increased the inflammation to the top of the reference range. So it is a tricky compound, and that's why I only recommend it during contest prep when there's something to win, but we'll get into that in the dosing video. And I think this pretty much concludes the history of Trenbolone and my opinion on it. I'll sprinkle in a little bit of opinion in the other videos as well. Oh, and before we wrap up this video, don't ever consider taking Trenbolone with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen to reduce the inflammation. Yes, NSAIDs will reduce systemic inflammation quite significantly, but the problem is Trenbolone has been shown to be kidney toxic, and the prostaglandins, some of them are vasoconstrictive, so they increase blood pressure. So Trenbolone is kidney toxic. A secondary side effect is increased blood pressure, which is kidney toxic by itself or can destroy the nephrons and lead to glomerular sclerosis and collagen buildup, reducing its functionality. And continuous use of NSAIDs, ibuprofen, has been linked to a kidney problem. So, guys, be careful, because those kidneys is very difficult to recover. And I would say it like this. You would have to look at it like this. You only get, let's say, before you see negative health ramifications, just an arbitrary number. Let's say you only get 2 years on Trenbolone in total before your kidneys start to show some deleterious health effects. So you would want to spread those 2 years out over the times that you're competing. And it's regardless of dose, because the prostaglandins will release at 50 milligrams of Trenbolone per week. And they will certainly release at 100 milligrams per day. It's not unheard of, right? I mean, I've done 150 milligrams of Trenbolone acetate per day on anonymous message boards recommendation, stupidly. I don't blame anybody but myself. It was my responsibility to take it. I took it for 4 weeks. Again, we'll discuss that a little bit later. And I think that pretty much wraps up the history of Trenbolone and its current status as a pharmaceutical. Again, it's only FDA approved for cattle and available in the form of pellets with Trenbolone acetate or Trenbolone acetate with Estradiol, which nowadays it shouldn't be even considered to use those pellets as a base for home brewing and get the Trenbolone acetate into a solution. There's plenty of underground labs out there that produce Trenbolone acetate, Enanthate, or Trenhex under, a wide variety of qualities. Again, we'll get into that in a different video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next Trenbolone profile video series video. And Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, comment, or comment again if you already commented, because I see a lot of algorithmic Vigorous comments in the comment section. So thank you guys so much for that. It really helps to grow this channel and push the videos to a new audience. Assuming a new audience would like to know about Trenbolone. I'm sure there's always somebody interested in that there Trenbalonie sandwich. See you guys in the next video.